Some nights the room goes so quiet that you can almost hear the quiet itself. A soft hum sitting just beneath your thoughts, so faint you're not even sure if you're imagining it. If this feels like a good place to rest tonight, you're welcome to stay just as you are, exactly like this. Now let's drift, because there's something strange about silence. Something almost nobody talks about tucked away in the space between your ears, waiting quietly for the world to grow still enough for you to notice it. You've probably felt it before. Late at night, lying in bed, the house finally settling into stillness. No traffic outside, no voices in the next room, and yet somewhere underneath all of it a faint tone, a low murmur, a sound with no clear source drifting at the very edge of hearing. Most people assume it's nothing, a trick of tired ears, something to ignore on the way to sleep, but researchers have found that this quiet sound is far more interesting than that. It seems that true silence, the kind with absolutely no sound at all, is something the human body has never actually experienced. Not once, not ever. There's a room built decades ago in a research facility designed to remove every trace of sound. Thick wedges of foam line every wall, every ceiling, every inch of floor. No echo can survive inside it. No outside noise can enter it. It is by every measurement available the quietest place that has ever existed on this planet. And when people step inside and the door closes behind them, something curious happens. At first there's relief, a kind of peace that feels almost unfamiliar. But within a few minutes that peace begins to shift into something else entirely. They start to hear their own heartbeat, not as a feeling in the chest, but as an actual sound, low and rhythmic, moving through the Kong Chi, through the air around them. Then comes the rush of blood, a soft, continuous whisper threading through the silence like a distant tide. Some people report hearing their own joints faint and creaking as they quietly shift their weight from one foot to the other. Neuroscientists have observed that no one has ever stayed in that room longer than about 45 minutes, not because it's frightening exactly, but because the mind, when given nothing external to listen to, doesn't simply rest. It starts listening to itself, and this is where the strange sound begins. The one you might have heard tonight in your own quiet room without an anechoic chamber, without any special equipment at all. A faint tone that lives somewhere between your ears and your thoughts, so gentle that most people never stop to wonder where it actually comes from. It seems that our ears are not simply doorways for sound to pass through. Scientists suggest they may be a little more active than that, capable of producing something on their own, quietly, continuously, whether we notice it or not. We'll come to that in a moment. For now, just notice how strange it is that silence, real silence, might not exist at all. Not out there in the world, and maybe not even in here inside you. Your body hums, your blood moves. Your nervous system carries on its slow, steady conversation with itself. Whether you're paying attention or not, whether you're awake enough to hear it or already halfway into sleep, psychologists often note that most people go their entire lives without ever truly sitting still enough to notice this. The days are loud. The evenings are filled with small tasks, small sounds, small distractions. It's usually only late at night in a room like this one, in a moment like this one, that the noise of the day finally fades enough for something quieter underneath to rise to the surface. Maybe you felt that tonight already. A soft ringing, a gentle static, a tone so faint it feels more like a memory of sound than sound itself. If so, you're not imagining it, and you're certainly not alone in it. It seems that the human brain has always been listening to more than the world outside. It listens to itself as well, in ways most of us were never taught to notice in a language made of frequencies too soft to name. So for tonight, there is nowhere you need to be and nothing you need to figure out. Just let your body settle a little deeper into wherever you're resting. Let your breathing slow on its own without being told to. And somewhere underneath all of that, if you listen very gently without trying too hard, you might notice that faint hum again, waiting patiently the way it always has. It's been there longer than you think, and it has quite a story to tell. That faint hum you noticed a moment ago, the one sitting so quietly beneath your thoughts, has a kind of history to it. Not a personal history, but a biological one. Something written into the architecture of your ears long before you were born. Because it turns out your ears are not simply listening. They're also, in their own quiet way, singing. Researchers have found that most human ears produce a faint sound of their own, all on their own, without any outside noise ever reaching them. It's called an otoacoustic emission, though the name matters far less than what it actually means. Somewhere deep inside your inner ear, in a small spiral structure no larger than a pea, tiny hair cells are meaning not reacting to sound and making it. Picture that for a moment. Somewhere inside your head right now, thousands of microscopic cells thinner than a strand of silk are gently vibrating on their own rhythm in their own quiet frequency. Not because anything asks them to, just because that is what they do. It seems this happens in nearly everyone, whether they realize it or not. Most people never notice because the sound is impossibly soft, buried far beneath the noise of daily life. But with sensitive enough equipment, a small microphone placed gently at the entrance of the ear canals, scientists can actually record it. A faint specific tone unique to each ear, like a signature, written in sound. Some people have several of these tones at once layered quietly on top of each other. Others have just one, and a few, interestingly, have almost none at all, which doesn't mean anything is wrong. It simply means their inner architecture hums a little differently than most. What's strange in a soft and almost beautiful way is that these hair cells were once thought to be purely receivers, structures built only to catch sound waves and translate them into signals the brain could understand. A one-way conversation sound coming in, information going out. But researchers have found that these same cells can also push back. When a sound reaches them, certain hair cells don't just bend and register it. They tighten, contract, and amplify the vibration, almost like turning up a volume that was too quiet to hear otherwise. And in doing so, some of that motion escapes, drifting back out through the ear canal as a nearly inaudible echo. A sound made in response to sound. A tiny act of participation rather than simple reception. It changes the picture a little, doesn't it? The idea that hearing isn't just something that happens to you, it's something your body quietly does moment by moment with a kind of active care most of us never think about. Evidence suggests this mechanism plays a real role in how well we hear soft sounds, how we tell one frequency apart from another, how a whisper across a room can still reach us even when it's nearly lost beneath everything else. Your ears, in other words, aren't passive doorways. They're closer to instruments that tune themselves, adjusting their own sensitivity from one moment to the next without asking for permission first. There's something almost tender about that. A part of your body working quietly on your behalf night and day, never announcing itself, never asking to be noticed. And it seems this ability begins remarkably early. Studies indicate that even before birth, while still resting inside the womb, tiny developing ears are already forming this same active response. Long before a baby ever opens its eyes, long before it hears its first lullaby, its ears are already awake in their own quiet way, already capable of that small internal hum. It's strange to think that the very first sound many of us ever made wasn't a cry or a breath or a heartbeat. It might have been this, a soft otoacoustic whisper, entirely our own, echoing gently inside a small, dark, unfamiliar world, long before we had any sense of what a world even was. Now here's where it becomes even more curious. Scientists are still exploring exactly why this happens. Not the mechanism itself, which is fairly well understood, but the deeper question underneath it. Why would evolution build an ear that talks back to itself? Why would a system meant purely for listening also need a voice of its own, however faint? One idea gently offered rather than firmly declared is that this active amplification helps protect delicate hearing structures from being overwhelmed. Like a system that not only receives but constantly fine-tunes itself in real time, quietly adjusting its own sensitivity so that a loud sound doesn't damage what a soft sound needs to survive. Another idea, a little more poetic in its implications, is that this constant internal activity may be part of what keeps our hearing so remarkably precise. Not a flaw, not background noise to be ignored, but a kind of continuous calibration and ear that is always listening to itself in order to better listen to the world. Either way, what we understand so far suggests that your ears were never truly silent. Not once, not even in the womb, not even now in this quiet room at this quiet hour. Which brings us back to that hum from before, that faint tone sitting somewhere at the edge of your attention. It may be that some part of what you're noticing tonight isn't coming from outside at all. It may be your own inner ear set it quietly active, quietly working, producing a sound so soft it usually goes unheard beneath the noise of an ordinary day. There's something oddly comforting in that. The idea that even in the deepest quiet, even in a room with no music, no voices, no distant traffic outside your window, you're never actually alone with silence. Some small part of you is still humming softly along, keeping a kind of quiet company with itself. The brain tends to treat this sound as background, filtering it out so completely that most people go their whole lives without ever noticing it's there. But late at night, when everything else grows still, when the mind has nowhere left to focus but inward, sometimes that filter softens just a little, and what was always there quietly rises just enough to be noticed. Not a warning, not a symptom of anything, just a faint, steady reminder that your body has been quietly active this entire time, keeping its own gentle rhythm long before you ever thought to listen for it. So if you're lying somewhere quiet right now, and there's a faint tone sitting just beneath your thoughts, you can let it be exactly what it is. A small ordinary hum, a part of you that has been humming since before you were born and will likely keep humming long after tonight is over. There's no need to search for it or study it or try to understand it fully right now. It's simply there, the way your breath is there, the way your heartbeat is there, quietly doing its work in the background of everything else. And somewhere close to that same quiet hum, there's another kind of sound the ear sometimes makes, a little more noticeable, a little more curious, one that many people have wondered about at some point in their lives, usually late at night in a room very much like this one. We'll come to that gently in just a little while. For now, let your ears rest exactly as they are, still working quietly, faithfully somewhere far beneath your thoughts. You don't need to do anything at all. Just let the hum continue soft and steady while everything else in you begins to settle a little deeper into stillness. That other sound, the one many people notice at some point in their lives, usually arrives quietly without any warning at all. A thin high tone, a gentle ringing. Something that seems to hover just behind the ears, present one moment and gone the next. Researchers have found that most people experience this at least briefly somewhere in their lives. A few seconds of a soft ring in a silent room, a faint whistle that rises and fades on its own. For most it passes as quickly as it arrives, barely worth a second thought. For a smaller number of people, this tone becomes a more constant companion, staying present even in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Scientists have a name for this, though the name matters far less than the science behind it. What matters more is understanding gently what's actually happening. It seems that this sound isn't coming from the outside world at all. There's no vibration in the air, no source you could point to, no way to record it with a microphone the way you might record an otoacoustic emission. Instead, evidence suggests it comes from somewhere deeper, from the auditory pathway itself, quietly generating a signal even when no real sound is present. Think of it a little like a room that's grown so used to a particular hum that when the hum finally stops, the silence itself feels strange, almost too quiet. The nervous system, in a similar way, seems to fill certain gaps with its own quiet signal, especially when very little sound is coming in from the outside. Most researchers now believe this isn't a problem with the ears themselves, but something closer to a shift in how the brain processes sound over time. Not a flaw, not a malfunction, just a different kind of listening one, where the mind occasionally supplies its own faint note in place of an expected one. The mind quietly registers patterns of sound throughout the day so consistently, so continuously, that this becomes part of how it understands the world. And in a very quiet room, when almost nothing is arriving from outside, that same system doesn't simply switch off. It seems to keep gently humming along the way. A familiar song might keep playing quietly in your thoughts long after the room has gone silent. For most people, this is nothing more than a passing ordinary experience. A brief tone here and there, mostly unnoticed, easily forgotten. It's simply one more example of how active, how alive our internal sense of hearing really is, even in moments that feel completely silent. And that in its own way is a rather gentle thing to understand, because it means the mind isn't a blank space waiting for sound to arrive. It's something closer to a quiet, constant presence, filling in soft edges here and there, keeping its own faint rhythm even in the stillness. There is a quieter layer to this one that reaches even further than sound itself, because if the mind can fill a silence with a faint tone of its own, it raises a soft, curious question. What else might it be quietly filling in without us ever noticing at all? That question lingers softly for a moment, the way a thought does right before sleep present, but not urgent, curious but not demanding an answer right away. Because it turns out filling in gaps is something the brain does constantly in ways that reach far beyond sound. Neuroscientists have observed that perception itself may work less like a camera recording the world exactly as it is, and more like something quieter, something closer to a constant gentle guess. Consider something as ordinary as a conversation in a noisy room. A voice speaks, but a passing car, a clattering cup, a burst of laughter nearby covers part of a word. And yet more often than not, the listener hears the whole sentence anyway, complete and untouched, as if nothing had been missing at all. Researchers have found that in moments like this, the brain doesn't simply notice a gap and leave it empty. It tends to reach into memory, into pattern, into everything it already expects to hear, and quietly fills that space with a sound that was never actually there. Not a mistake, not a flaw in hearing. Something closer to a kind of gentle completion, the mind smoothing over a small missing piece, so seamlessly that the listener never even notices the seam. There's an old experiment, simple in its design, that captures this rather beautifully. A word is played aloud, but a small piece of it is quietly removed and replaced with a short burst of noise, a soft cough perhaps, or a brief click. And when people are asked afterward where exactly in the word that noise occurred, most of them will not say. Not because they weren't listening closely, but because their minds had already restored the missing sound so completely, so convincingly, that it simply didn't feel missing at all. It seems that this is happening far more often than most of us realize, not just in noisy rooms, but in the quiet, ordinary moments of everyday listening. A half-heard word across a table, a muffled phrase through a wall. The mind steps in gently, almost protectively, offering its best guess, so smoothly that the guess feels indistinguishable from the truth. There's something quite tender in that if you sit with it for a moment. The idea that your mind is not simply receiving the world exactly as it arrives, but constantly quietly taking care of you within it. Smoothing rough edges, filling small silences, making sure the story you're hearing feels whole even when parts of it never quite reached your ears at all. Psychologists often note that this same tendency extends well beyond sound. The eyes do something remarkably similar with sight, quietly filling the small blind spot each of us carries in our vision, a tiny gap where the optic nerve meets the retina, a spot where no visual information can be received at all. And yet almost no one notices it because the brain fills that space in with the surrounding patterns so convincingly that a blank spot in the world simply disappears. It may be that hearing works on a similar quiet principle. Studies indicate that much of what we perceive as sound is not a pure unfiltered signal travelling straight from ear to awareness, but something gently shaped along the way, informed by expectation, by memory, by the countless sounds a person has already heard across a lifetime. Think of it a little like walking a familiar path in the dark. You don't need to see every step clearly because your feet already know the way. The mind does something similar with sound, using what it has learned before to guide what it expects to hear now, filling in the darker, quieter parts of the path with quiet practice confidence. This is sometimes called predictive processing, though the phrase itself is far less important than the feeling it describes. A brain that isn't just reacting to the world moment by moment, but constantly gently anticipating it, reaching slightly ahead of each sound, each word, each note, preparing a soft place for it to land. And it seems this becomes especially noticeable in the particular hush of nighttime. In daylight, the world offers so much information that there's rarely a need to notice the mind's quiet guesswork. But late at night, in a room like this one, with far less sound arriving from outside, that same predictive quality doesn't disappear. It simply has less to work with, and so it becomes a little more present, a little easier to sense, which may explain something rather gentle about lying awake in the dark. The way a house settling into its frame can sound just for a moment like a distant footstep. The way the hum of a refrigerator down the hall can drift briefly into something that almost resembles a whispered word. Not because anything strange is happening, but because the mind, quietly doing what it always does, is reaching into the near silence and offering its best, softest guess. What we understand so far suggests that this tendency isn't something to be wary of. It's simply part of how a mind stays gently oriented in the world, filling small gaps with quiet familiarity rather than leaving them unsettled and empty. A kind of built-in comfort offered without ever being asked for. There's a particular kind of ease in knowing this, that the strange half-formed sounds sometimes noticed at the edge of sleep are not something foreign arriving from outside, but something familiar, something entirely your own, simply your mind continuing its quiet work of making the world feel a little more complete. And if the mind is capable of shaping sound this gently, this carefully, it may also be shaping something a little closer to memory itself, holding on to pieces of what it hears in ways that last far longer than the sound itself ever does. Memory, it turns out, holds on to sound in a way that's a little different from how it holds on to almost anything else. Close your eyes for a moment, if they aren't already closing on their own, and think back to the very last thing someone said to you today. Not the meaning of it, not the words written out in your mind like text on a page, but the actual sound of it. The particular tone of that voice, the small rise and fall in how it was spoken. For a few seconds after it happened, that sound was still there whole and complete, almost as if it was still playing somewhere just behind your ears. And then quietly, without you ever noticing the moment it happened, it faded. Researchers have found that the human mind holds on to raw sound for only a few brief seconds after it occurs in a kind of temporary holding space before that sound dissolves into something else entirely. This is sometimes called echoic memory, and it works a little like a small pool of water catching a single raindrop. For a moment, the ripple is still visible, spreading gently outward, and then the surface settles again and the ripple is gone. It seems this window lasts somewhere between 2 and 4 seconds, rarely longer. Long enough to let a listener catch the end of a sentence and still make sense of the beginning. Long enough for a half-heard word to be quietly reconsidered and understood correctly, even after the sound itself has already stopped. There's something rather remarkable hidden inside that small window of time, because in those few seconds the mind isn't simply remembering a sound, it's still in a very real sense hearing it. Neuroscientists have observed that this kind of memory doesn't feel like a memory at all while it's happening. It feels like the sound is still present, still unfolding, even after the air around you has already gone still again. Think of it a little like the last note of a bell, the actual metal no longer moving, and yet the tone still seems to hang in the room for a moment longer, soft and fading before it finally settles into silence. This is quite different from the kind of memory most people think about when they hear the word. Not a photograph tucked away in a drawer, pulled out occasionally to be looked at again, something closer to an afterglow, brief lingering presence that exists only for a few seconds and then quietly, gently lets go. And yet, brief as it is, this small window seems to matter more than its short lifespan might suggest. Studies indicate that echoic memory plays a quiet, essential role in how we understand spoken language at all. Because words don't arrive all at once, they unfold across time, one sound following another, and the mind needs to hold the beginning of a sentence gently in place while it waits for the rest to arrive. Without that brief holding space, language might dissolve into fragments, sounds arriving and vanishing too quickly to ever form a complete thought. But because of it, a sentence spoken slowly across several seconds can still feel to the listener like one single, unbroken idea. There's something quietly moving in that. The understanding of a whole conversation depends on the mind's willingness to hold on to something softly and briefly, just long enough for it to make sense before letting it go entirely. Beyond this fleeting echo, there's a longer kind of sound memory too, one that can last for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. Psychologists often note that certain sounds seem to embed themselves far more deeply than others. Not through effort, not through any deliberate attempt to remember them, but simply because of when and how they were first heard. A particular song heard often during a certain season of life can return decades later, carrying the full weight of that time. Not just the melody itself, but a kind of atmosphere around it. The temperature of a room, the quality of light through a window, a feeling that arrives before any conscious thought does. Evidence suggests this happens because sound memory is rarely stored in isolation. It tends to link itself to the emotional state a person was in at the time, woven together in the same quiet moment, so that hearing the sound again can even briefly bring a small trace of that original feeling back with it. This is part of why a certain song can make someone feel for just a few seconds as if they've stepped back into a much younger version of themselves. Not because the memory is being replayed exactly as it happened, but because the sound has quietly carried an emotional echo forward, one that the mind never fully let go of. It may be that this is one of the oldest, gentlest functions sound has ever served for us, not simply to inform, but to anchor. A way of marking certain moments so clearly that even years later a few notes or a familiar tone of voice can return you there, if only briefly, if only softly. Late at night, in the quiet stretch just before sleep, this kind of memory seems to surface more easily than usual. With fewer sounds arriving from the outside world, the mind sometimes turns inward, instead allowing older, half-forgotten sounds to rise gently to the surface. A voice from childhood, a particular laugh, the specific creak of a door that hasn't existed in years. None of this needs to be searched for or chased or held onto too tightly. It tends to arrive on its own quietly the way it always has, drifting up from somewhere. The conscious mind rarely visits during the busier hours of the day. What we understand so far suggests that every sound you've ever truly paid attention to has left some small trace behind, even if you can't consciously recall most of them. Not stored the way a file might be stored, but held instead in something more like a soft, layered impression, one sound quietly resting beneath another, reaching all the way back, further than most of us ever think to look. There is a quieter layer to this one that most people never consider, because if sound can be remembered this deeply easily, this personally, it may not simply be resting somewhere in the mind, still and unchanging. It may be doing something far more active than that, even now, even while you're lying here listening to nothing at all. There's a particular kind of sound that almost everyone knows, even if they've never had a name for it. A melody that arrives uninvited, plays quietly on its own loop and simply refuses to leave. Maybe it happened to you recently. A few notes heard once in passing on the radio in a store, drifting from someone's open window, and hours later, long after the actual sound has stopped, some small fragment of it is still turning over quietly in your mind. Not the whole song, just a piece of it. The same 4 or 5 notes circling gently again and again. Researchers have found that this happens to nearly everyone at some point, and for many people it happens fairly often, sometimes several times a week. It's sometimes called an earworm, though the phrase itself sounds a little more unsettling than the experience actually is. In truth, it's something closer to a small harmless loop, a fragment of memory that has simply found itself stuck in a very gentle groove. What's curious is that it's almost never the entire song. Studies indicate that these looping fragments are usually quite short, somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds of music repeating on their own, without any conscious effort to remember them at all. As if the mind picked up only a small piece of something and then, for reasons still not entirely clear, decided to keep replaying just that piece, over and over like a single page torn from a much longer story. Neuroscientists have observed that this tends to happen with music that carries a particular kind of structure, simple repetitive melodies, a steady easy rhythm, small singable phrases that the mind can hold on to without much strain. It seems the brain has a quiet preference for patterns that are just predictable enough to follow easily, yet just unusual enough to stay interesting. A melody that fits this balance seems to slip into memory with very little resistance, and once there, it doesn't always want to leave right away. There's something rather charming in that if you think about it gently. That the mind isn't drawn to complexity here. It's drawn to a kind of simplicity and ease, a pattern smooth enough to rest inside of. Psychologists often note that these loops tend to appear most often during quiet, low-effort moments. Washing dishes, walking somewhere familiar, lying in bed with the lights already off. Almost never during moments of intense focus. It seems that when the mind has fewer external tasks demanding its full attention, it has a little more room to keep replaying something on its own quietly in the background, almost the way a room left empty might still hold the echo of a conversation that happened there earlier in the day. This is part of what makes earworms feel so oddly personal. They rarely arrive during the busy, crowded hours of a day. They tend to surface in the softer spaces between tasks, the same quiet spaces where memories, feelings, and half-formed thoughts also tend to rise closer to the surface. A looping melody late at night, then, isn't so different from a half-remembered image from years ago drifting quietly into awareness. Both seem to prefer the same quiet conditions to appear. There's an idea gently supported by research that this repetition might actually be an accidental side effect of something the brain does quite well most of the time, which is prediction. The mind tends to enjoy anticipating what comes next in a familiar pattern, humming along internally with music the same way it might finish a sentence in its own thoughts before someone else has said it aloud. With most songs, this natural anticipation settles once the song has fully played and reached its ending, but with certain short fragments, especially ones heard only partially or interrupted before they finish, that internal anticipation seems to have nowhere to resolve. And so it seems to simply keep circling, gently searching for a kind of completion it never quite reaches. It's a small, oddly touching thought that some part of the mind may be replaying a melody not because it's stuck exactly, but because it's quietly waiting for an ending that was never given to it. What we understand so far suggests that these loops are almost entirely harmless, a normal, ordinary feature of how memory and rhythm interact with each other. For most people, they last a few hours at most, sometimes only a few minutes before fading on their own, replaced quietly by something else, another thought, another sound, another small fragment of the day settling into place. There's a gentle detail here worth pausing on for a moment. Certain kinds of songs seem more likely to create this looping effect than others. Not because of anything unusual about the songs themselves, but because of how our minds seem to process rhythm and melody together. A steady, moderate tempo close to the rhythm of an ordinary walking pace seems to fit particularly well into memory. It's almost as though the mind prefers a pace it recognizes from the body itself. A rhythm close to footsteps, close to a heartbeat at rest, close to something already familiar before the song ever began. This may explain in a soft way why lullabies have endured for as long as they have, across nearly every culture in nearly every language. Simple, repetitive, slow, built from the same gentle qualities that seem to settle easily into memory and stay there. A lullaby isn't only meant to be heard once, it's built in a sense to linger, to circle quietly in a small mind long after the room has gone dark and quiet. There's something rather lovely in imagining that the same quiet mechanism responsible for an ordinary earworm might also be part of why certain songs feel like they've stayed with a person for their whole life. Not stored away and forgotten, but kept gently in motion, resurfacing every so often, uninvited but never entirely unwelcome. The mind quietly registers these small musical loops, the same way it registers so much else that happens beneath conscious awareness without asking permission, without announcing itself, simply arriving, circling for a while, and eventually settling back into the quiet from which it came. There is a quieter layer to this one that most people never consider, because if a fragment of music can circle so persistently inside the mind, simply looking for somewhere to land, it raises a soft, curious thought about everything else that might be moving through us, in the same quiet way even during sleep itself, when the mind seems to keep working long after the rest of the body has finally gone still. There's a particular threshold the mind crosses most nights so gently that almost no one ever notices the exact moment it happens. It isn't the moment of falling fully asleep, it's earlier than that. A soft, thin space between being awake and being asleep, lasting only a few minutes, sometimes less. Scientists have a name for this transitional state, though. The name matters far less than what quietly happens inside it. In this narrow window, the body is still resting in the same bed, the same room, the same familiar stillness. But the mind, in its own quiet way, has already begun to loosen its grip on the ordinary rules of waking thought. And it's here in this soft in-between that some of the strangest, gentlest sounds a person will ever experience tend to arrive. Researchers have found that many people, somewhere between 40 and 80%, depending on how the question is asked, experience brief auditory sensations in the minutes just before sleep. Not dreams exactly, since dreaming in its fuller form usually comes later, deeper into the night. Something more fragmentary than that. A single spoken word heard clearly in a voice that doesn't belong to anyone in the room. A short burst of unfamiliar music, playing for just a few seconds before fading into nothing. Someone quietly calling a name that might not even be the listener's own. It seems that these sounds are almost never frightening in the moment they occur, though people are sometimes startled afterward, wondering quietly where exactly that voice or that music actually came from. Neuroscientists have observed that as the mind eases towards sleep, certain regions responsible for generating internal imagery and internal sound become more active, while the regions responsible for filtering and organizing sensory input begin to quiet down. It's a little like a house where most of the lights are slowly being turned off room by room, except for one small lamp near the back left glowing a little longer than the rest. In that softened, half-lit state, fragments of memory, fragments of imagination, and fragments of real, recently heard sound seem to loosen from their usual places and drift together more freely than they would during full wakefulness. a voice from a conversation earlier that today, a phrase from a passing thought, a rhythm the mind was quietly holding on to from earlier in the evening, all of it gently unmoored, floating a little closer to the surface than usual. This particular state is sometimes called the hypnagogic period, drawn from an old word meaning to lead into sleep. And it seems this leading process isn't smooth or linear. It happens in small uneven pulses, the mind drifting toward rest, then briefly surfacing again, then drifting a little further the next time, each pass carrying its own small fragment of sound or image along with it. Evidence suggests that this happens in part because the brain doesn't switch instantly from one state to another, the way a light switch turns a room from bright to dark in a single motion. It shifts more gradually, more like a dimmer, being turned slowly, different systems easing into rest at slightly different speeds. For a brief window, some parts of the mind are already behaving as though asleep, generating loose dreamlike fragments, while other parts remain just alert enough to notice those fragments happening. That's the strange, gentle overlap where these sounds seem to live. Not fully a dream because there's still a thin thread of awareness watching it unfold. Not fully waking thought either, because the ordinary structure of conscious attention has already begun to loosen its hold. Psychologists often note that the content of these hypnagogic sounds tends to reflect whatever occupied the mind most recently. Someone who has spent the evening around music is more likely to hear fragments of music. Someone who spent the day in conversation is more likely to hear fragments of speech. It's as though the mind, in its final unwinding, is simply setting down whatever it was still quietly carrying one small piece at a time. There's something rather tender in imagining it that way. Not the mind malfunctioning or slipping into anything unusual, but simply unpacking itself gently before rest, the way someone might set their bag down slowly by the door after a long day, one item at a time, before finally sitting down. Sometimes these hypnagogic fragments arrive as a single clear word spoken by no one in particular. Studies indicate that this is one of the more common forms. This experience takes a brief, isolated phrase, sometimes ordinary, sometimes oddly specific, appearing and disappearing within a second or two. It rarely connects to anything happening around the sleeper. It seems to arise instead from language centers of the brain briefly active in this transitional state, producing speech without any listener in mind and without any speaker behind it either. Other times it arrives as texture rather than words, a soft static, a distant hum, a sound almost like wind moving through a space that doesn't exist. What we understand so far suggests that these textures may come from the same auditory regions responsible for imagining sound briefly active on their own, untethered from any real external source. None of this needs to feel unusual or concerning. It's a soft, ordinary part of how many minds ease towards sleep, night after night, mostly unnoticed, mostly forgotten by morning. Most hypnagogic experiences fade so quickly and so gently that by the time full sleep arrives, no memory of them remains at all. It's only on certain nights when a person is especially close to the surface of awareness as it happens that the moment gets caught and remembered before it can dissolve. If you've ever heard your own name spoken softly just as you were drifting off in a voice that wasn't quite anyone's, this may be part of the answer. If you've ever heard a brief, unfamiliar melody rise and fall in the seconds before sleep, this same quiet threshold may be where it came from. Not something arriving from outside the mind, something forming gently from within it in that narrow, softened space where waking and sleeping briefly overlap. There's a certain kind of comfort in that. The idea that even in this in-between moment, half in the world and half already leaving it, the mind isn't producing anything strange or unfamiliar. It's simply continuing its quiet work a little differently than usual, letting sound and thought move a little more freely, right before it finally lets everything go. And sometimes in that same soft threshold, something a little more sudden can happen too. Not often, Not for most people, but every once in a while in that narrow space just before sleep fully arrives, the mind produces something a little sharper than a whisper, something worth understanding gently so that if it ever happens, it can be met with quiet familiarity instead of surprise. Every once in a while in that same narrow space just before sleep, something a little more sudden can happen. Not a whisper this time, but something closer to a single brief burst of sound arriving and disappearing within a fraction of a second. Some people describe it as a soft bang, like a distant book falling shut. Others describe it more like a quiet clap of thunder felt somewhere inside the head, rather than heard from outside. It happens without warning, always in that same drowsy threshold right before sleep, and it passes almost as quickly as it arrives. Researchers have found that this experience, though, can feel startling in the moment, appears to be harmless, a normal variation in how some nervous systems ease into rest. It's sometimes called exploding head syndrome, a name far more dramatic than the actual sensation itself, which is usually painless and over within a second or two. It seems that this happens when certain neurons ordinarily responsible for gradually powering down as the body prepares for sleep briefly misfire instead, firing together all at once, rather than settling smoothly in sequence. Something like a room full of lights that are supposed to switch off gently one by one, but for a brief moment flicker together instead before finally going dark. Most people who experience this only notice it occasionally, sometimes just once or twice in an entire lifetime. And what we understand so far suggests it isn't connected to anything concerning, simply a small uneven ripple in the mind's usual graceful transition toward rest. That's really all there is to it. A brief passing moment mentioned here only so that, if it ever happens to you, it can be met with a quiet nod of recognition instead of any worry at all. What's more interesting in a slower and gentler way is what happens on the nights when nothing sudden occurs at all. Because even in ordinary uneventful sleep, the ears are never fully off duty. And this seems to be one of the more overlooked details about how a sleeping mind actually works. Studies indicate that hearing is the last of the major senses to fully quiet down as a person drifts into sleep, and the first to become alert again upon waking. While the eyes have long since closed and the sense of touch has softened into the vague, distant awareness of a blanket or a pillow, the ears remain quietly active, listening in the background, even while the rest of the mind rests. This isn't simply background noise passing through unnoticed. Neuroscientists have observed that a sleeping brain continues to process incoming sound, sorting it, evaluating it, deciding on some deep and mostly unconscious level whether it matters enough to be worth waking up for. Think about how a parent sound asleep after an exhausting day can somehow stay undisturbed through a television left on in the next room, through traffic outside the window, through the ordinary creaks and hums of a house settling into the night, and yet stir instantly at the faintest, softest sound of a child's cry from down the hall. It isn't that the sleeping mind ignores everything equally. It seems to quietly filter what it hears, allowing familiar, harmless sounds to pass by without disturbance, while certain other sounds are treated differently, held to a much lower threshold, before they're allowed to reach conscious awareness. Evidence suggests this filtering happens largely in a small deep structure called the thalamus, sometimes described as a kind of gatekeeper for incoming sensory information. During sleep, this gatekeeper doesn't close the doors entirely. It simply becomes more selective about what gets allowed through, based on patterns the mind has already learned to recognize as either safe or important. A person's own name spoken softly nearby tends to break through sleep more easily than an unfamiliar name of similar volume. A smoke alarm's sharp, repetitive pitch tends to override sleep far more reliably than a much louder but more monotonous sound like steady rainfall. It seems the sleeping mind isn't simply measuring volume. It's quietly measuring meaning, drawing on a lifetime of learned association, even while the rest of the body lies completely still. There's something rather moving in that if you let yourself sit with it for a moment. Even in the depths of rest, some quiet part of you is still standing, a soft kind of watch, not out of worry but out of something closer to care, listening gently on your behalf so the rest of you doesn't have to. Psychologists often note that this ability likely reaches far back into a much older version of human life long before soft beds and quiet locked rooms. A version of life where sleeping fully unguarded might have meant real danger, and where a sleeping mind needed some way to remain gently alert to its surroundings even while the body rested. What remains today may be a quiet inheritance from that older world, a nervous system still keeping a small, careful watch through the night even now, in rooms far safer than the ones our ancestors once knew. This is part of why certain sounds can wake a person instantly from a deep sleep, while other louder sounds barely register at all. It isn't about how loud something is, it's about what that sound has come to mean learned quietly over months and years, then carried gently into the sleeping mind as a kind of soft, standing instruction wake for this but not for that. It may be that this is one of the reasons familiar sounds tend to make sleep easier for so many people. A gentle, steady presence like rainfall or a quiet fan or a familiar voice reading something soft and slow close by. Not because these sounds are being ignored, but because the sleeping mind has already quietly decided they are safe. And once something is marked as safe, it seems to slip into the background far more easily, allowing deeper rest to settle in behind it. There's a certain comfort in imagining it this way tonight, that your ears even now are still gently listening, not with tension, not with worry, but with a soft, practiced kind of care, sorting the world quietly in the background so that the rest of you is free to let go completely. Because it turns out some of the sounds that matter most to a resting mind were never about information at all. They were about feeling. And that particular thread, the quiet emotional weight certain sounds seem to carry, is something the mind has been holding on to for far longer than most people ever realize. That quiet emotional weight certain sounds carry doesn't begin the way most people assume. It doesn't start with a favorite song or a meaningful memory built consciously over the years. Evidence suggests it begins far earlier than that, long before memory in the ordinary sense even exists. Studies indicate that hearing is one of the very first senses to develop before birth, active in a quiet, muffled way by roughly the 18th or 20th week inside the womb. Long before there's any language to understand any face, to recognize any world outside, to make sense of there is already sound. Filtered through fluid and tissue, softened and low, but present and continuous and close. The dominant sound in that early world isn't speech and it isn't music. It's the mother's heartbeat, a steady rhythm, surrounding the earliest formation of a nervous system alongside the low, constant hum of digestion, breathing and blood moving quietly through the body. Researchers have found that this rhythmic soundscape becomes in a very real sense the very first environment a person ever knows, before light, before touch in any conscious sense, before anything resembling a memory that could later be recalled in words. It seems this early wordless exposure leaves a lasting imprint, not as something a person can consciously remember, but as a kind of deep familiarity wired quietly into the nervous system before there was ever a self there to notice it happening. This may be part of why certain rhythms, steady and unhurried, close to 60 or 70 beats each minute, feel so universally calming across nearly every culture on Earth. Not because anyone was taught that this rhythm meant safety, but because in some sense everyone already knew it long before they ever had words for comfort at all. Neuroscientists have observed that the auditory pathways in the brain sit unusually close to the structures responsible for processing emotion, more closely intertwined than most of the other senses. A region called the amygdala, often associated with emotional response, receives signals from the auditory system through a notably short, quick pathway, one that can trigger a feeling before the sound has even been consciously identified or named. This is part of why a certain tone of voice can settle a racing heart before a single word has been understood, why a sudden sharp sound can cause the whole body to tense, even before the mind has had time to ask what that sound actually was. Hearing, it seems, was never simply about information. From its very earliest moments, it has always been deeply, quietly entangled with feeling. There's a particular kind of sound that seems to carry this most clearly of all the human voice, and more specifically, the voice of someone deeply familiar. Psychologists often note that infants can distinguish their mother's voice from other voices within just a few days of being born, sometimes even earlier, responding to its particular pattern and rhythm in ways that don't happen with unfamiliar voices. It may be that this early recognition forms one of the very first emotional templates a person ever carries. Long before trust is something one thinks about consciously, it may already exist quietly in the body, shaped by nothing more than a familiar rhythm of sound heard closely and often enough to feel on some deep level like safety itself. This could explain something many people have felt but rarely paused to examine closely. Why the sound of rain against a window can feel so quietly comforting, even to someone who has never once thought about it in those terms. Why a certain specific hum, low and steady, wrapped gently around a room, can make an unfamiliar space feel instantly softer, instantly safer, without a single conscious thought passing through the mind at all. What we understand so far suggests that the body may be quietly recognizing these sounds, not through memory in the way we usually think of it, but through something older and more physical, a kind of resonance formed before language, before conscious thought laid down during the earliest, most formative weeks of a nervous system's development. There's a tender thought resting inside all of this, that long before you had a name, before you had a single word to describe how you felt, some part of you already understood the difference between a sound that meant calm and a sound that meant alertness. That understanding never fully left. It simply grew quieter over the years, tucked further beneath layers of language and thought, waiting patiently to be gently stirred by the right rhythm, the right tone, the right kind of hush. This is perhaps why certain kinds of sound seem to reach people so much more quickly than words ever could. A parent humming softly to a distressed child without any particular tune in mind, often more effective than any spoken reassurance. A low, steady voice offered gently in a difficult moment, capable of settling a nervous system faster than the actual content of what's being said. Evidence suggests this is because emotional response to sound often happens faster than conscious understanding does. The nervous system responds first in a matter of milliseconds, and the conscious mind, slower and more deliberate, only catches up a little afterward, quietly filling in the reasons once the feeling has already arrived. There's something rather beautiful and a little humbling in that order. The body listening first and understanding second, feeling arriving before thought ever has the chance to explain it. And this pattern doesn't disappear with age. It continues quietly for an entire lifetime. One of the reasons certain songs from childhood can still decades later bring a sudden and unexpected softness to the chest before the mind even remembers the specific memory attached to them. The feeling arrives first. The story behind it follows only after, if it follows at all. Late at night, in the particular hush of a room like this one, this older, quieter layer of listening tends to become a little more present than usual. With the noise of the day fully settled, there's more room for these deeper wordless responses to rise gently to the surface. A familiar voice, a steady rhythm, a low, comforting hum in the background, each one reaching towards something that has very little to do with meaning and everything to do with the way it simply feels to be held gently by a sound that has always meant safety. The mind, it seems, has been keeping something still and patient all along. A quiet library of feeling built from sound long before it ever had the words to describe what any of it meant. And somewhere close to that quiet library there's a voice that never really left at all. Not one belonging to someone else this time, but one belonging entirely to you. That voice belonging entirely to you is in its own way the strangest sound of all, stranger than any hum in a silent room, stranger than any echo left behind by a memory, because it isn't quite a sound in the way the ears usually understand sound, and yet somehow it's heard as clearly as any voice ever could be. Right now, as these words are being read or listened to, something quiet is likely happening in the background, a kind of inner narration, a voice unmistakably yours following along, forming words, perhaps even repeating certain phrases silently, without a single sound ever leaving the body. Researchers have found that most people experience this almost constantly throughout the day, an ongoing stream of inner speech so continuous and so familiar that it rarely draws any attention to itself. It's often only in quiet moments like this one late at night, with fewer outside distractions competing for space, that this inner voice becomes easier to notice at all. It seems that this internal voice isn't simply imagined in some vague abstract way. Neuroscientists have observed that when a person silently talks to themselves, whether rehearsing what to say later, replaying a conversation from earlier, or simply narrating a passing thought, many of the same brain regions activate as when they speak out loud. The motor areas responsible for actual speech become quietly active even though no muscle ever moves and no sound ever escapes into the air. There's something rather remarkable in that a voice existing only within the mind can still recruit so much of the same machinery the body uses for real spoken language. As though somewhere deep inside the brain there's very little difference between speaking aloud and speaking silently, only a small final gate that decides whether the words are released into the world or kept quietly inside. This inner voice seems to serve far more than idle commentary. Studies indicate that it plays an active role in memory and planning, in working through difficult emotions, even in maintaining a stable sense of self over time. When a person silently reminds themselves of a phone number, repeating it internally until they can write it down, that's inner speech quietly supporting memory. When someone rehearses what they might say in a difficult conversation, running the words gently through their mind before speaking them aloud, that too is this same inner voice working things out in private long before anything is spoken to another person at all. It seems this ability develops earlier than most people realize, and in a rather touching way. Psychologists often note that young children frequently speak their thoughts out loud without any self-consciousness at all, narrating their actions as they happen, thinking through problems in a voice everyone around them can hear. Only gradually as a child grows does that same voice begin to move inward, quietly folding itself into the private space of the mind, until it becomes the silent narrator most adults carry with them for the rest of their lives. There's a certain kind of intimacy in imagining that the quiet voice inside your head today is, in a real sense, the same voice you once spoke freely out loud as a very young child, simply grown a little quieter, a little more private over many years of gently turning inward. What we understand so far suggests that this inner voice draws heavily on something called the default mode network, a set of connected brain regions that becomes especially active during rest, during quiet reflection, during exactly the kind of unstructured moments that tend to arrive late at night, right before sleep. It's sometimes described as the brain's resting activity, though resting may not be quite the right word for it. It's less like stillness and more like a quiet, ongoing hum of reflection weaving together memory, imagination, and a persistent ongoing sense of self. Evidence suggests this network becomes noticeably more active whenever the mind isn't focused on a specific external task, which may be part of why inner speech tends to grow louder, in a sense, during quiet moments like this one. With fewer outside demands pulling attention outward, the mind naturally turns a little more inward, and that quiet inner voice, always present but often overshadowed during a busy day, has a little more room to be heard. There's a particular question that tends to surface once people start paying attention to this inner voice, and it's a gentle one worth sitting with for a moment. If this voice sounds so much like actual speech, using words, using sentence structure, even carrying its own particular tone, does someone who has never heard spoken language at all still experience something similar? Researchers who study this have found something quite moving in their answer. People who are deaf from birth, who have never heard spoken language in the way most people do, still describe a rich, active form of inner narration. For those raised using sign language as their first language, this inner voice often takes a different form entirely, not sound-based at all, but built instead from a kind of imagined movement. A sense of the hand shaping words internally silent and unseen, the same way a hearing person might silently sound out a sentence in their mind. It seems that what matters most isn't the specific sensory channel a language moves through, whether sound or gesture. What seems to matter is language itself, and the mind's deep quiet need to keep using it internally to think, to plan, to hold a stable sense of self across time, even when there's no one else present to hear it or see it. There's something rather profound tucked inside that finding, that this inner narrator isn't fundamentally about hearing at all. It's about something a little deeper than that, a mind's quiet need to keep talking to itself in whatever form that conversation naturally takes, sound or motion, word or gesture, as a way of continuing to make sense of its own experience. This inner voice, this constant quiet companion, may be one of the closest things science has found to what people often mean when they speak of a sense of self. Not a single fixed thing, sitting somewhere inside the brain waiting to be discovered, but something more like an ongoing conversation held quietly and continuously, moment to moment. Yet somehow always present. Late at night, when the room grows still and the day's outer voices have finally gone quiet, this inner one tends to become a little more noticeable. Sometimes it drifts gently over the events of the day. Sometimes it rehearses a conversation that hasn't happened yet. Sometimes it simply narrates the quiet details of the room itself, the softness of the blanket, the low hum of the house, settling the particular quality of the darkness behind closed eyes. It may be that this is one of the last voices a person hears each night before sleep finally arrives. Not a voice from outside, not a memory of someone else's words, but this quiet familiar narrator, the one that has been present in some form for almost every waking moment of an entire life, gently continuing its soft commentary until even it too begins to slow down and quiet and finally rest alongside everything else. And underneath that voice, further down than words can easily reach, there's a slower kind of sound, still moving one that never depends on language at all, one that has simply been keeping its own steady rhythm this whole time, quietly, patiently, regardless of whether anyone was listening. That slower kind of sound, the one that never depends on language, has been present since long before the very first word was ever formed inside you. It doesn't rise and fall the way a voice does. It doesn't pause for thought or wait for meaning. It simply continues steady and unhurried the way it always has. Right now, somewhere beneath your ribs, that rhythm is quietly moving. A heartbeat close to 60 or 70 beats each minute if the body is resting has been playing without a single break since sometime before you were born, and it will keep playing without asking for rest for as long as you're alive. Researchers have found that the human heart doesn't beat with mechanical identical precision the way a metronome might. It shifts slightly with breath, with posture, with the motion speeding gently on an inhale, slowing gently on an exhale, a small living variation that never quite repeats itself the same way twice. It seems this subtle irregularity is actually a sign of a healthy, well-regulated system, A rhythm flexible enough to adjust itself constantly rather than rigid and fixed. There's something rather moving in that. A heartbeat isn't really a single unchanging note. It's closer to a long, quiet piece of music improvised gently in real time, shaped moment to moment by everything happening, both inside and around you. Neuroscientists have observed that this rhythm doesn't stay confined to the chest. Signals from the heart travel constantly along particular nerve pathways up into the brain where they're processed continuously well below the threshold of conscious thought. In a very real, measurable sense, the brain is always listening to the heart even when there's no awareness of it happening at all. This ongoing internal signal is sometimes referred to as introception, a word that simply describes the body's quiet ability to sense its own internal state. Evidence suggests that this constant inward listening plays a much larger role in daily experience than most people ever realize, quietly shaping mood, quietly shaping a sense of calm or unease long before any external event has fully entered conscious awareness. Breathing carries a similar quiet rhythm of its own, closer to 12 or 16 breaths each minute during rest, though. This number too shifts gently depending on what's happening in a given moment. Studies indicate that slow, steady breathing can actually influence heart rhythm directly, the two systems moving into a kind of subtle, natural synchrony with each other, especially in calm, restful states very much like this one. It's a small, quiet partnership, breath and heartbeat adjusting to each other continuously without any conscious instruction required, almost like two instruments in the same room gradually falling into the same soft tempo simply by being close enough to hear each other. Beyond breath and heartbeat, there's an even quieter rhythm still, one that doesn't come from the body at all, but from somewhere inside the brain itself. Researchers have found that brain activity moves in distinct measurable waves, rising and falling at different speeds depending on what state a person is in. Faster waves during focused active thought, slower, broader waves during quiet rest, and during deep sleep waves, slower, still rolling gently through the brain like long, unhurried swells moving across a calm sea. It seems these slow waves during deep sleep aren't simply a sign of the brain switching off. Neuroscientists have observed that this particular rhythm appears to play an active role in memory, gently sorting through the day's experiences, reinforcing certain connections while letting others quietly fade. A kind of nightly housekeeping carried out in complete darkness without any conscious participation at all. There's a certain kind of comfort tucked into that idea, that even in the deepest, most unaware hours of sleep, some part of the mind is still working quietly on your behalf, moving in slow, steady waves, gently tending to the day that's just ended, preparing a slightly clearer, slightly lighter version of you for the day that hasn't yet begun. What's especially curious is how closely these various rhythms seem to relate to one another. Heartbeat, breath, brainwave. Each one distinct, yet each one capable of gently influencing the others. Psychologists often note that certain slow, steady external rhythms, a metronome ticking softly, ocean waves arriving at a consistent pace, a lullaby with a gentle, unhurried tempo can actually help guide breathing and heart rate into a calmer, more regulated pattern. This may be part of why steady, repetitive sounds have been used to soothe restlessness across nearly every culture throughout history, long before anyone understood the biology behind why it works so well. A rocking chair, a ticking clock, a parent's slow, steady humming, each one offering the body an external rhythm gentle enough and steady enough for its own internal rhythms to quietly align with. It seems the body has always been listening to rhythm in every sense of that word, not simply through the ears, but through the heart, through the breath, through the slow electrical waves moving continuously through the brain. A kind of music that never really stops playing, whether or not there's ever a melody layered on top of it. There's something quite beautiful in imagining your body this way tonight, not as a silent, still thing waiting for sleep to arrive, but as something closer to a small quiet orchestra, each part playing its own steady part, heartbeat, breath, brainwave, all continuing gently together. Whether you're aware of them or not, whether you're awake enough to notice or already halfway into sleep, this music has been playing since before you had a name for any of it. It played through every ordinary day you've ever lived, every quiet night, every forgotten dream. It's playing right now in this very moment, low and steady beneath everything else. And it will keep playing gently on long after these particular words have faded, long after this room falls fully silent, carrying you forward the same soft way it always has. That small orchestra playing quietly beneath everything else has been with you this whole time, through every part of tonight's journey, through every sound explored and every silence noticed along the way. It seems fitting then to end somewhere close to where all of this began. Not in a laboratory, not in a chamber built to remove every trace of sound, but simply here in an ordinary room at an ordinary hour, with a body that has been quietly listening the entire time. Researchers have found that as a person drifts towards sleep, the brain doesn't shut down all at once the way a light switches off in a single motion. It settles gradually, layer by layer, the way evening settles over a landscape, slowly, unevenly, one shade of light softening into the next. Thought slows first usually. The sharp, quick edges of daytime thinking begin to round themselves off, ideas drifting a little more loosely from one to the next, less structured, less certain of where they're going. Then the muscles follow a soft heaviness, spreading through the arms, the legs, the shoulders, each part quietly setting down whatever tension it had been holding without needing to be told to let go. The breath slows too, a little deeper now, a little longer between each rise and fall, following its own unhurried rhythm without any real decision being made to change it. And underneath all of that, that same steady heartbeat continues, the one that has been present since long before this night began. Unchanged in its patience, unbothered by the hour, simply continuing the way it always has, the way it always will. It may be that everything explored tonight, the quiet hum in an empty room, the ear's own soft signal, the mind gently filling small silences, the earworms and half-heard whispers at the edge of sleep, the ancient rhythms carried since before birth, the quiet voice that narrates a life from the inside, all of it was really pointing toward the same soft truth all along, that you were never simply hearing the world. You were always in some quiet way part of the sound itself. There's no need to hold on to any of it now. No need to remember the details or make sense of what's been said or carry anything forward into the coming hours. All of it can rest now the way you're resting loosely, without effort, without any particular shape. The room around you is quieter now than it was at the beginning. Or perhaps it isn't quieter at all. Perhaps it only feels that way because something inside you has finally slowed down enough to stop noticing the difference between silence and sound. Somewhere far off, a very faint hum may still be there. It doesn't need your attention anymore. Your breath is slower now. Your body is heavier, settling further into wherever it's resting. The thoughts are further apart now, drifting slowly like something seen from a great distance. There's a kind of light that comes just before true dark, soft and low, without edges, without anything sharp left in it. That's close to where you are now. Nothing more needs to happen. Nothing more needs to be heard. Just this quiet. Just this breath. Just this slow, soft fading, like the last note of something gentle still hanging faintly in the air, long after the sound itself has already let go.